Hello everybody, it's Marty McConnell, the Off-Grid Gecko. Today I'm going to be talking about making clay. This one's not quite ready yet. So this is the final step. I'm showing you some of this stuff kind of backwards, just bear with me. But so for the final step of the process, we're basically going to take a pillow sheet and we're going to take our recovered clay and put it in here. And we'll get to the rest of the process here in a moment. You just let this hang until it's ready, until it firms up, and then take it out. And you'd still have to dry it out some, more than likely. Spread it thin, let it dry, and then work it up. And working is kind of outside of the scope of this video. I think that's where my problems were last year mainly, was with working the clay prior to actually throwing it or trying to turn it into pottery, because it kept getting crumbly on me, and then if it was too moist then it was sticky. So like finding that perfect balance, and it seemed to be a very fine line with the clay that I had. So I'm going to try doing a little more on the preparatory work for the clay this year to make pots. So that's the end of the process. It's hanging it in this bag, and you'll see clear water dripping off this. There's still a little coming out of it for a couple days, like I said, and then it'll kind of set up and firm up and get hard. So to get this from dirt is a little bit of a trick. It requires a little bit of work, and I'm going to show you that process real quick. Welcome to the pit. Okay, so this is a mixing stick that I just chopped out of a log. A little quick work with a hatchet, it takes about 10 minutes. And then this is the mud bucket, and then the collection buckets are over there. I'll show you those in a minute. We'll start with the mud bucket. This is where the raw clay goes to be extracted. And you can tell, you can see all this gravel and fine stuff down here at the bottom. This is all what came out of the clay. Alright, during this process, it's sort of the end. The stuff's depleted, it's ready to move on. We're going to dump it over here so we can get a clean bucket. Kind of dump it out on the ground. It's dirt. We're going to get dirty. And then this over here is the pit. So I found a nice pit. It's got some good clay down there in the bottom of it. You can see some of this dried stuff after the rain. That's a rock. But the dried stuff is very mashable. If it's slightly wet, it's very mashable. Otherwise, it's very crumbly and just falls apart in thin particles. There's not a whole lot of impurity in this like I had to deal with last year, and it just makes a nice solid lump. So, should be good working clay. But the only way you're really going to know is to fire it. So our method of extraction here is pretty simple. About right there, it changes from soil to clay, and you can tell by a changing color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dig back this way and open this pit up a little bit so I can get access to more of the good stuff. And of course all this topsoil is not being wasted either. It's being thrown here in a big old pile for relocation purposes. And you can kind of tell once the digging gets a little harder, you're into clay. And I threw a bunch out, oh well. So I'm going to grab some of this clay. And we'll toss them in the bucket. And since this isn't too rocky, a third of the way full works out pretty well for extraction purposes without it getting too heavy down there in the bottom with all the rocks. When you find your clay, you just take some of it and work it down and squeeze the air bubbles out, and it should make a good workable mold like this. I mean, it's nice, it's squishy. This stuff's a little bit crumbly, it's got a lot of debris in it still, but looks like we got about 1 inch of rain. So the next step is to add water. Now, When you do this the first time, you'll have to bring water in from somewhere, obviously. But once you get started, you can actually recover the water from your collection buckets back here that are going to be collecting the clay and pour it right back into your mud bucket, and then mix up a new batch and then dump it over. So I'll go through the whole process right now. The first step is to add water. Now I'll be a little careful because this does have good clay in it and I don't want to get it stirred up. And you notice this water's got kind of a creamy, milky color to it. I think it's obviously another sediment in there that's too fine to actually settle out with the rest of the clay. But I may be able to recover that by boiling this water later and see what it is, because it may be another clay mineral like kaolin or some kind of porcelain type fine china clay. And so if I can recover a decent amount of it just by boiling, that'll be awesome. You might be able to see there's this big thick clay body down in the bottom of this water. That's the good stuff that you're going to be collecting. So whenever you believe that you've collected enough of it, you basically take the water out as much as you can and then try and pour the water off gently. Drop the remainder into another bucket where the clay will collect, and then when you pour it off when I pour it into here, I usually run it through a really fine sieve just to get any residual little particles and roots and stuff that might be hiding in there. So again, we're working both steps at once, working from the back and from the start. So the next step in the clay making process, as far as this is concerned, is to get this really good and stirred up. And at the beginning, it's going to be quite thick on the bottom, and it's going to take it a while to slake. So we're going to help it along by sort of pushing it around and beating it up. And when it's fresh like this, that's also when you're going to have the most roots and stuff like that in it. It almost looks like liquid chocolate. And you can start to feel and see the water will start to thicken. If you want to take a shortcut, you can actually stir this until it's really, really thick and then sieve it off directly into one of those pillowcases and go ahead and hang it and see what you end up with. You'll get clay a lot faster that way. It just, actually I can't think of too many downsides. I might try that. But for today, we're going to extract it. You're going to end up with a lot of sediment in it too if you do it that way. So the main thing for us is getting it away from the sediment. Now as I stir this, it's not just clay that's going into the water, so a lot of little sand particles and small bits of other stuff are working their way into the emulsion, like the water's got them churned up and stirred up, like if you stick your foot in a muddy riverbed and you just stir up all that silt. That's all in the water right now, but that stuff settles out pretty quick. So we're just going to give this a good mix in and get it mixed up as good as we can. And then I like to stick this thing in there for a minute just to kind of slow the water roll a little bit, keep it from bouncing around too much. Pull these bigger chunks of root out. Another thing I like to do when I can is skim some of this crap off the top. So I always get a little bit of froth in this. And you basically come around with your little colander or a spoon or whatever and kind of scrape some of this scum off. I don't know what the scum's composed of. Might be something interesting for somebody to look into. Alrighty, once this guy's set up for about a couple minutes, 5 maybe, then I'm going to pour it off. Now I've got a hard wire screen here. This is basically just to catch the big stuff. Got that on top of a bucket, and as you get like lower and lower into this, then that won't be as necessary anymore. But especially at the beginning, you're going to have a lot of big pieces of root and stuff like that. want to try and sieve out as much of that crap as possible. And I don't see too much sediment in the bottom here, so I think we're good. So we've got it sieved. Take our bucket and we're going to pour that back very quickly into the collection bucket. Then we go again. Now for every gallon that you transfer this way, you're going to have about a quart of clay in there that goes with it. So I just transferred about 7 gallons. So I should have about 7 or maybe 5 or 6 quarts worth of clay. So a good gallon of clay in there for one, transition. The trick is kind of getting it out. But, just to give you an idea, if it's mixed up really well, it'll settle down to about 1/8 of its volume will be clay, and then the rest of it will be water. And then it looks like this. So it's kind of hard to tell because it's cloudy, but the clay has gone down to the bottom, and on the top you've got this mostly clear water. Like I said, it's got a little cloudiness into it. There's obviously some fine sediment in there that won't settle out, but when you leave it to sit for about 8 to 12 hours, then all of a sudden all that clay is going to go down to the bottom, and the water is going to squeeze out of it and come up, and in that way we can recycle the water and put it back in the mud bucket, and then we can fill this guy back up, which is what I was trying to say before. But sometimes it's easier the second time around, and that's why this is a very cyclic process. So it's easier to talk about it in terms of all the steps at once than it is to really go step by step, unless you're only going to be doing this for one batch, and then it's kind of pointless because this takes about 10 to 15 minutes a day, or at least if you're doing it once a day, it takes 10 to 15 minutes. Each time you do it, you can do it 2 to 3 times a day, and you can just harvest massive amounts of clay if you've got enough collection buckets. That's the secret. So now we've just filled this one up. I'm going to go ahead and skim this excess water off of this one, put it in the bucket with the mud, mix it up again, and then repeat the process and dump that water in here, and then I'll let both of these guys sit for about 12 hours, and then they'll both kind of look like this again, and then the process can be repeated. Of course, it's going to take a little while to get all the clay out. So, we've got a couple rocks emerging now. That one. But this is still mostly clay. And I probably put a good 7 to 10 gallons worth of mud in here. So if we assume that's like 7 gallons worth of clay, and I'm moving roughly a gallon each time, it's going to take at least 7 trips or 7 cycles to get it out. I find it takes a little more than that. It's not 100%. It doesn't work necessarily 100% efficiency all the time, but within the span of a week, like, I'll empty this bucket and then all that'll be left is that little rubble like we had in there when we started. So just rocks and sticks, and there just won't be anything left to collect. And then it's time to fill it up with more clay mud at that point. So pretty easy, pretty slick. There's really not much more to it than that, honestly. It's a pretty basic process for removing clay. Now, there's other ways to do this. You can take some of this dry clay, like this stuff. Let me get a chunk here. Get most of the dirt knocked off it. You can get these dry chunks of clay, and you can actually crush these up and beat on them with a stick, or roll them out, or whatever you have to do, and just mash it up into a powder. And then you can sieve the powder just like you would flour or something else, and that will remove all these little tiny rocks like this and little sticks that are in there, and then you can rehydrate the powder. To me, that's more labor intensive. This is easy. It takes a little longer, but It's simple, and I can jack with this for 15 minutes a day, and I'm producing more clay than I can ever use. So that's kind of my main goal. Yeah. And the more collection buckets you have, obviously, the faster you can get the clay extracted and then move on to other things. So the collection buckets are really the secret. Um, if you have to double up on mud buckets, then that means you're probably, well, you shouldn't ever have to double up on mud buckets, to be perfectly honest. Like one mud bucket should be enough to serve um, as many receivers as you want, and then once you get it down to that little rocky core, then you can get rid of it. If I can get some more of these buckets lined out, I'd like to have 5 or 6 of them ideally, and then I can completely deplete this in like 2 days and then get another batch in here, and at that point I'm just making clay like a maniac.